Forensic psychology is the application of psychological techniques to law and criminal justice. And an aspect of this that's captured the public imagination in Hollywood movies like Silence of the Lambs and TV shows like Mindhunter and Criminal Minds is criminal offender profiling.
So what's the reality behind the hype? What exactly is criminal or offender profiling? What do profilers do? And does it work? So is criminal profiling like it is in the TV shows? We thought we'd ask some experts.
Offender profiling is simply trying to generate a profile of an unknown perpetrator based on clues or other types of evidence that might be found at the crime scene.
Where you can infer an offender's characteristics from the way in which he or she commits a crime.
And the idea is that those behaviours exhibited by criminals have some unique kind of quality that can be used to understand the criminal mind and maybe help identify the offender.
Usually the types of crimes that an offender profiler would be called in to advise the police would relate to linked series of crimes, especially linked series of crimes in relation to rape and in relation to murder.
So while specialist crime officers look at crime scenes for physical evidence, psychological profilers look for information that may suggest something about the offender's personality, his location, or previous history.
And here we're going to look at two different approaches to criminal profiling.
Ever since there's been crime or wrongdoing, there's been some sort of profiling. In the Middle Ages there were profiles of witches, like this one. Probably elderly woman living alone with an interest in herbal medicine. And in London in the 1880s, Thomas Bond, a police surgeon, tried to profile the personality of so-called Jack the Ripper, a serial killer of prostitutes. But profiling only became established in 1972 in the United States with the creation of the FBI's Behavioural Science Unit.
Experienced investigators like John Douglas drew on their expert knowledge of crime to help police investigations in serial rape and homicide cases that seemed to have stalled. The idea, according to Douglas, was to try to get inside the swamp-like mind of the offender, and this came to be known as a top-down approach.
The top-down process focuses very much on individual crime scene behaviours and individual things that offenders may do, either before the crime's committed, during or after.
A key idea in this approach was the difference between organised and disorganised crime scenes. An organised crime scene suggests planning and forethought.
So for example, if a weapon was brought to the scene and precautions were taken during the crime, then this indicates an organised offender.
The idea being that an organised offender will be an offender who thinks and plans about their crime in advance. They go to their crime prepared and they know what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. The converse is the idea that a disorganised offender is more of an opportunistic criminal. They don't plan and prepare, and it's more of a spontaneous, ill-thought-through criminal behaviour.
So even at this differentiation between organised and disorganised, we're back into these psychological principles about behaviour and about personality.
However, by the turn of the century, an alternative approach to profiling was emerging. One coming from psychological research rather than the knowledge and intuition of experienced investigators. And one based less on individuals and more on aggregates and statistics. This was called a bottom-up approach.
This approach used scientific theories and evidence-based from lots and lots of different cases and examples to then provide an evidence-based model for profilers to use.
Bottom-up profiling really isn't to do with individual clues at crime scenes, but it's more to do with what we know about the greater collective of criminal behaviours and criminal backgrounds.
So bottom-up profiling isn't about trying to unravel the criminal mind. Rather, it's about piecing together statistical evidence. And one of the tools used is smallest space analysis.
Smallest space analysis looks at the relationships between each variable and every other variable and then represents this in a geometric space. The higher the correlation between two behaviours or characteristics, the closer they'll appear in the visual space.
And smaller space analysis is a way of clustering those variables together geometrically. And so what we're trying to do is have the minimum amount of space geometrically between different variables.
So in general terms, the top-down approach is deductive. Profilers draw on their expertise to develop theories which are then applied to the evidence. Whereas bottom-up approaches tend to be more inductive. Systematic examination of evidence reveals patterns, which are then used to make inferences about offenders.
So, two approaches, top-down and bottom-up. But do they work and help police investigations?
Top-down profiling has had some spectacular successes, which profilers like John Douglas have been only too happy to tell us about. For example, in New York in 1979, the body of Francine Elverson was found on the rooftops of her apartment building. She'd been raped, murdered and mutilated. A single hair found on her body led police to start looking for a black male. However, Douglas profiled the killer as an unemployed, sexually inadequate white man aged between 25 and 35 with a history of mental illness. A profile that matched and led to the arrest and conviction of Carmine Calabro, 32 years old, unemployed and mentally unstable.
But there have also been spectacular failures they're less happy to talk about.
In 2002, John Allen Williams and Lee Boyd Malvo went on a 10-month killing spree across the United States, murdering 17 people. The police were offered profiles which had them looking for white men, probably in a white van. Williams and Malvo had been stopped by police several times, but released each time because they didn't fit the profile. Later summarised by a police officer as wrong place, wrong ages, wrong race, wrong men. And in London, on the advice of a profiler, police investigating the murder of Rachel Nickel on Wimbledon Common set up and then arrested and charged an innocent man, Colin Stagg. And tragically, while police were focusing all their attention on Stagg, Nickel's actual killer, Robert Napper, went on to murder another young woman.
Psychologists have made a number of conceptual criticisms of the top-down model, and one of them is the assumption of homology.
This is the idea there's a consistency between people's everyday behaviour and their behaviour at a crime scene. The crime scene will reflect who they really are. But half a century ago, psychologists were demonstrating that situations, particularly situations of power and control, can dramatically change people's everyday behaviour, so they act out of character.
75 volts, Jim.
This one will be 195 volts.
Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment showed how quickly perfectly ordinary college students could be transformed into either psychopathic guards or passive, compliant prisoners. And so it's very likely that people will be behaving out of character at crime scenes.
And methodologically, the criticism of top-down profiling is that many of the claims and predictions just couldn't be tested. But in the last decade, things have changed in the world of criminal profiling.
It is not sufficient to just make a claim. There must be a transparent method of how the profiler came to make that claim, based on science and things that are verifiable post-conviction.
So profiling today is less about inspired deduction and more about collecting hard objective evidence.
If a woman under 30 is murdered, it's probably by a young guy, because statistics show that 80% of women who are murdered under 30 are killed by men between 25 and 30. If a woman is raped by a stranger, it's probably someone who lives nearby. Research into solved rape cases showed that over half the offences were committed within 3 miles of the offender's home or base.
But does this more scientific, statistical, evidence-based approach help the police solve more crimes? Well, the jury's still out.
If you ask, does criminal profiling lead directly to the identification and arrest of offenders, as it does in the TV shows, the answer has to be very rarely. In a famous study of 184 cases, predictions by profilers were accurate in about 66% of cases. However, they only led to an arrest in 5 cases, or 2.7%. But when police in different countries are asked to evaluate profiling,
the benefits of using a profiler are generally, it narrows down the investigation to certain areas or certain people.
the majority of them say they find it helpful.
So how do we explain this apparent contradiction? Well, to do so, we need to get away from the idea that criminal profiling is all about profilers leading police directly to offenders.
I wasn't magically, like Sherlock Holmes, going to come into an investigation and go, elementary, my dear Watson, this is the perpetrator.
But criminal profiling has several functions.
I would simply be a fresh pair of eyes. I'd be listening a lot to what the senior investigating officer had said in relation to the evidence that he or she has generated, the kinds of people they were interested in, the sorts of forensic evidence that had been generated at the crime scene. So in one sense, all I would really be providing for the police is a form of reassurance.
Psychological profilers can also assist in other ways. For example, training police in different interview techniques which can help to obtain more and better evidence from witnesses and suspects.
And perhaps most importantly, while criminal profilers only rarely lead police directly to offenders, like they do in shows like Mindhunter, the evidence suggests that they help indirectly by narrowing the focus of police inquiry.